acquiring the drug, being high on it, recovering from the drug, or trying to quit the drug. Tolerance, which means that the more the longer you use, the more you need to reach the desired effect. Using it in dangerous situations such as driving, etc. So these are the common criteria we use to define addiction. And to that extent, cannabis is addictive. It used to be thought at one time that animals would not self-administer cannabinoids, and now there's data showing that monkeys will self-administer cannabinoids. All these data put together would suggest that cannabis is addictive. And as a physician, as a psychiatrist working at a hospital, people are actually showing up asking for treatment for cannabis addiction because they can't quit on their own. And unfortunately, we do not have any good treatments for cannabis addiction.
And so you're not suggesting that it's more addictive than any of the other drugs or even caffeine or anything. You're just simply stating that it's addictive.
No, in fact, I said that if you were to rank order the addictive liability of these drugs, cocaine would be on the top of the list. Opioids would be at the top of the list, and nicotine would be higher than marijuana. So clearly, marijuana is not as addictive as cocaine. Just want to be clear about that.
And just to be clear, because this is my understanding, and you would probably know better than me. You had an exchange with Representative Walker about what was in the DSM, and there's a discussion about marijuana use disorder. And as I read through marijuana use disorder, I also read about the fact that we aren't really sure about addiction because marijuana use disorder and dependency is often used in the place of actual addiction. Could you expand upon that? Talk about that?
The difference between addiction and dependency?
Yeah.
I don't think there's much of a difference between the two. When you become dependent on a drug, what it means is that you cannot function without exposing yourself to that drug. And to that extent, I think marijuana is addictive, and people can get dependent on it. You may have missed the testimony earlier, but one of the common reasons why some of the people seeking help for cannabis addiction is that they cannot sleep without smoking, or they cannot eat without smoking. This may represent a very small group of people, but nevertheless, there are people who become addicted to it in a way that we would describe any other addiction. That is, they spend a lot of money. Their family members don't like the fact that they do it. They can't operate it. They can't really function at school. Their grades are failing, and they have trouble at work because of their use of marijuana. These are all the factors that go into describing something as being addictive.
So, just for my clarification, is that opinion consensus? Because in the literature I read in preparation for this, there was a distinction made, and I'm not talking about someone writing an opinion piece. I'm talking about medical literature, psychological. So there was a distinction made between dependence and addiction. So is your opinion consensus?
I think I think addiction and dependence are often used together.
Right. Well, okay. So as I suggested, what I read said that they are often used together, but that is part of what clouds our actual understanding of whether or not people are addicted. So I'm just trying to get clarity. I'm not pushing. I'm just trying to make sure I understand.
I think I don't see a distinction between addiction and dependence. To me, they're very much the same things, and I use it interchangeably. I'm not sure which article you're referring to. I think the use of the word addiction has been phased out from mental health because it was often seen as a pejorative. So it's much more it's kinder to call people being dependent on nicotine or dependent on cocaine than calling them addicts. That word just carries so many negative connotations that in mental health we've moved away from using that term.
So and that's valuable to me because that doesn't seem to comport with what I read, but I trust your expertise because you're an expert. But it will lead me prior to the point at which maybe we JF this bill to go back and read again because I think it will become part of the discussion. There was a discussion about the mixing of alcohol and marijuana. And I would agree with you from what I've read, and since you're an expert and you agree with that, I would agree with you that everything you said was true. Just for information, there are studies. There's one in Washington, Katrina Gutmanova and others did a study based on peer-reviewed research, and they could not nail down whether or not it was true that marijuana usage reduced alcohol consumption or it increased alcohol consumption based on the studies that had been done. And yet, I think I heard you suggest that it made sense that it would be an increase. So, how do you know that?
No, I don't think I said that. I was referring to the interaction between alcohol and cannabinoids on driving.
Right, and I thought in exchange with Representative Smith that you both seemed to agree that someone using marijuana would increase their usage of alcohol.
No, I'm sorry if that came across that way. No, I don't think
Okay,
I said that.
that's yeah.
I think, I guess we could look at the testimony. I think what Dr. D'Souza said was that in a situation where someone is likely to use marijuana, alcohol might be available and be more likely to be used, and vice versa. So nothing to do with increase, but just the availability of one versus the other in certain social situations was how I understood it.
Okay, I'll leave that there. And one final question about the inability to do a study on young people, which makes perfect sense to me. We would very unlikely do that. What animals did we use to do the study that we did? What animals, rodents? I don't know what we used.
So the studies looking at the effects of cannabinoids on brain development, most of those studies have been studies in rats and mice, and they're the choice animals to study because their brain development has been well characterized, and if you see a change, you'd be able to detect that fairly easily. So yes, the studies have been done in rats and mice.
Isn't there a difference among species on the density of cannabinoids? And rats and mice in particular, doesn't the cannabinoid system there, the type of density, wouldn't it act upon the part that has effect on a motor system differently than in a human?
That's a great question. Obviously, there are species-related differences, and so one cannot directly extrapolate data that was done in rats to humans. We are so much more complex, but what those animal studies allow us to do is to do things that we would never be able to do in humans, which is that you randomize groups of young adolescent mice and give them cannabinoids and alcohol and placebo and sacrifice them and look at their brains and look at the morphology of the brain. Those are things we could not do. So I think that to paint this picture of what cannabis is doing, we need all these different kinds of studies. Animal studies that have advantages but also have limitations, such as cross-species differences. Human studies, observational studies that there are so many other things that could happen that one can't account for in observational studies. And all that together will allow us to create a much more comprehensive picture of the effects of cannabinoids.
And I thank you for your testimony. And if you wanted to respond, Dr. Pettit, that's fine.
No, I suggested that Dr. D'Souza review some of the primate data as well as being closer to human.
There's some primate data too, but most of the recent data has been in rodents.
Right. And so the only reason I wanted to question that is because I do happen to know from having researched this that there's a difference in the density of receptors and how it works. But I appreciate your testimony. Thank you for spending some time with us. Okay.
So what's really important is that we have now discovered that the endocannabinoid system, unrelated to exposure to cannabis, is very important in brain development. And what I mean by that is in adolescence, the brain undergoes tremendous changes where you're born with, let's say, 100 billion neurons, and in adolescence, that's shrunk down to 40 billion neurons. And that process of pruning is really important. And this pun is not intended, but bad synapses are weeded out, and good synapses are strengthened. And the endocannabinoid system plays an important role in it. But the endocannabinoid system has effects that last milliseconds, whereas THC has effects that last for a much significant period of time. So it's a non-normal way of stimulating the system.
Thank you.